I remember the first words I heard when I came to. They were not the kind of words a man expects to hear when he is fighting to wake up from surgery, his body heavy as stone, his mind reaching for something solid to hold on to. They were cold, whispered sharp, and they sliced through the haze like a knife. "The bank confirmed it," my daughter Rachel said. "The account is ours now." Those words shot through me stronger than any sedative could. My eyes didn't open right away, but I heard every syllable. And in that half-light of consciousness, when the machines clicked and the faint scent of disinfectant hung heavy in the air, I felt something far worse than physical pain. I felt betrayal. If you enjoyed this story, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box to the right. Lying there in Riverside Memorial with the dull ache of the hip surgery grinding through me, I knew in my bones that life as I'd trusted it had changed forever. I slowly forced my eyes open. The room was blurred, the edges of the ceiling lights blooming with halos. Rachel's figure stood near the bed, her back slightly turned, her blonde hair pulled into that tight bun she always wore when she wanted to look composed. Beside her was Mark, my son-in-law. His hand rested casually on the rail of my hospital bed as though he had a right to stand guard over me. I didn't speak, not yet. The nurse had told me before surgery that it might take hours before I could form words clearly, and I used that weakness now. I let them believe I was still drifting while I listened. "We'll need to move fast," Mark murmured, his voice low, but not low enough, before he gets strong enough to start asking questions. Rachel nodded. "He won't suspect a thing. He trusts me." Trust. The word sat in my chest like a stone. I kept my breathing steady, shallow, like a man still too groggy to comprehend. But inside, every part of me sharpened. I'd worked with iron and grease most of my life. I knew what it meant when something cracked under pressure. You had two choices: you welded it back together or you watched it collapse. And in that moment, I knew Rachel and Mark thought I was the one about to collapse. The door opened and closed softly. They must have stepped out, satisfied I was too far under to matter. That gave me time. I turned my head slowly toward the window. Through the glass, I could see the Michigan sky, flat and gray, and a bare oak tree shaking in the late fall wind. I thought of Margaret, then my late wife, the woman who had kept me steady through every storm. She'd warned me once in a quiet kitchen conversation years ago that Rachel had a hunger she couldn't name. "Be careful," she had said, "ambition can turn into something darker when it has no anchor." I had brushed it off then. A father doesn't want to believe his only daughter could betray him. But now her words echoed in that sterile hospital room truer than ever. Footsteps padded back in. Rachel's heels tapped lightly against the tile. She leaned close, her perfume cutting through the smell of antiseptic. "Dad," she whispered, testing if I was awake. I stayed still, eyelids heavy. She let out a small breath of relief. Then papers rustled. "Tomorrow we'll bring in the documents. Just a few signatures, and this will all be settled." Mark's voice answered, smoother, almost rehearsed. "It's better for everyone this way. He'll have peace. We'll handle the stress." Peace, stress. Pretty words for theft. I wanted to shout to tell them I could hear every poisoned word, but something held me back. Maybe it was the weakness in my body, or maybe it was a deeper instinct, one forged from years of working with men who underestimated me. "You don't tip your hand until the weld sets." The beeping of the monitor beside me slowed steady. Rachel patted my hand, cold and businesslike. Not the touch of a daughter, but of someone sealing a deal. "Rest now," she said softly. "You don't have to worry anymore." I didn't move. I didn't let my face betray the fire that was building inside me. When they finally left the room again, I opened my eyes wide. The ceiling above seemed endless, a blank sheet. My throat was dry, my body heavy, but my mind was alive. I thought of my savings, every dollar I had scraped and saved since I was a boy working at the rail yard. I thought of Margaret's hands on mine the day we opened that account together, her eyes warm and certain. That money was supposed to keep me steady in old age, to make sure Rachel never had to carry the weight of my care. And now here she was, plotting to take it all, while I lay cut open and stitched back together. No, I wasn't going to let them win that easily. The nurse returned to check on me, humming under her breath. She adjusted the IV, glanced at the monitor, and smiled when she saw my eyes open wider. "Welcome back, Mr. Dawson," she said gently. "You're stronger than you look." I wanted to laugh, stronger than I looked. She didn't know how true that was about to become. As the night settled over the hospital and the hallway lights dimmed, I lay awake replaying every word Rachel and Mark had spoken. Each phrase hardened my resolve. Betrayal burns, yes, but it also clarifies. It strips away the illusions you carried, and it forces you to see people for who they really are. Rachel was my daughter, but she was also now my enemy, and I knew one thing with absolute certainty: I would not go quietly into the dark corner she had prepared for me. Sleep never truly came to me that first night. The pain medication kept me floating just above the surface, but every time my eyes drifted shut, Rachel's words jolted me back. "The account is ours now." The words repeated like a hammer on steel, striking again and again until sparks flew in my chest. Somewhere in the hallway, a cart squeaked past, a nurse whispered, a machine beeped in steady rhythm. Those were the sounds of healing. But inside me, something else was waking, something sharper. I shifted carefully, testing the strength in my hands. The IV tugged at the crook of my arm, reminding me how tethered I was. Yet even with my body weak, I felt a strange kind of clarity. My whole life, I had been underestimated by supervisors who thought a rail yard mechanic wasn't worth much, by neighbors who assumed I'd fade into retirement quietly, and now by my own flesh and blood. They thought this surgery had left me defenseless. They were wrong. The next morning, sunlight pressed through the blinds in slanted lines. Rachel came in with a paper cup of coffee and that tight smile of hers. "Morning, Dad," she said brightly. "How are you feeling?" I met her eyes for the first time since surgery. My throat was raw, but I managed a whisper. "Still here." Her smile faltered for a heartbeat. Mark wasn't with her this time. She set the coffee on the tray and fussed with the blanket like a nurse who didn't know where to put her hands. "You don't need to think about bills or accounts," she said casually, too casually. "Just focus on resting. We'll handle the details." I let the silence hang heavy between us. I'd learned long ago that silence can be louder than words. She fidgeted, tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, and finally cleared her throat. "The hospital will need some papers signed soon. Nothing urgent, just things that make it easier for me to help you." That word again, help. I wanted to call her out right there to tell her I knew what game she was playing. But instead I nodded slowly, eyes half-lidded, as if her words barely registered. Let her think she had the upper hand. Sometimes you need to let the fire build before you open the furnace. After she left, Dr. Brooks stepped in. She was brisk, competent, the kind of woman who didn't waste words. She checked the monitor, adjusted my pillow, then leaned close. "Mr. Dawson," she said quietly, "I need you to know something." Her eyes were steady, the kind that made you believe she'd seen more than most people could handle. "Your daughter asked me to sign additional documents yesterday. Papers that would have given her broader control over your finances. I refused. I also contacted an attorney I trust. His name is Tony Delgado. He'll explain more when you're ready." For a moment the room spun. I wasn't shocked. Rachel's whispers had already poisoned the air, but hearing it confirmed by the doctor hit me harder than the scalpel had. I swallowed, my throat burning. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because she said simply, you deserve the truth. And because I've seen too many families tear each other apart in rooms just like this. Don't let them write your story while you're still alive to tell it." Her words landed deep. Margaret would have said the same thing. When Dr. Brooks left, I stared at the coffee Rachel had left behind. The steam had faded, leaving only a bitter scent. That was Rachel I thought, warm enough on the surface, cold underneath if you waited too long. I knew then that my road back to strength wouldn't just be about healing bone and muscle. It would be about reclaiming what was mine, not only the money, but the dignity they thought they could strip away. As the day wore on, visitors came and went. Nurses checked vitals. The TV murmured in the corner with news I didn't care to hear. But behind every sound, every face, there was the echo of Rachel's whisper and the weight of Dr. Brooks's warning. By evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the window orange, I made myself a promise. They thought I was weak. They thought I was blind. They thought I would hand over everything with a shaky signature. but they had forgotten who raised them. The following morning I woke to the steady hum of machines and the muffled chatter from the nurse's station just outside my door. My hip throbbed with a dull ache, but it was nothing compared to the fire smoldering inside me after the night before. Sleep hadn't washed away Rachel's words. If anything, they had grown sharper like shards of glass lodged in my chest. I was propped up slightly, a plastic cup of water on the tray beside me when the door opened. Rachel stepped in her heels, clicking lightly against the linoleum. She was dressed in a crisp blazer, hair pinned back in that severe style she always favored when she wanted to appear in control. A leather folder was tucked under her arm. "Good morning, Dad," she said, voice lilting with practiced cheer. She set the folder on the tray with a little thud, then moved the cup of water aside as if it were in her way. "I brought a few things that will make things easier for you." I stayed quiet, letting my breathing stay shallow, as though the act of speaking cost me too much. I'd learned over years of raising a daughter that sometimes silence was the best way to get the truth out of her. Rachel opened the folder and pulled out a neat stack of papers. Her fingers smoothed them on the tray table as though she were preparing a presentation for work. She slid a pen toward me. "These are just routine," she said, her tone light, almost dismissive. "The hospital likes to know there's someone who can handle things if you're not up to it. With these, I can take care of the bills, the insurance forms, all those stressful details. You won't have to worry about a thing." Her words carried that polished rhythm she'd perfected over the years, the rhythm of someone used to convincing clients at a law firm. Only now her client was me, her father still stitched together from surgery and barely strong enough to sit upright. I let my eyes fall to the papers. I didn't need to read them to know what they were. I'd heard enough the night before. Power of attorney. A few signatures and everything I had worked for Margaret's and my savings, the house, the accounts would be under her control. I reached out with a trembling hand, fingers brushing the pen. My movements were slow, hesitant. Rachel leaned in, eager, watching closely. I could feel her breath catch as the tip of the pen hovered over the first line. Then I let it slip from my fingers. The pen clattered against the tray with a hollow sound. Rachel's smile faltered, her jaw tightening. "Dad, you dropped it," she said, forcing a chuckle. "Your hands are still weak, that's all. Here, let me help you steady it." She reached for the pen, but I shook my head slightly, a whisper escaping my lips. "Not now." The words were fragile, but they carried weight. I saw it land on her face. For a split second, something flickered in her eyes. Annoyance, maybe even anger, but she masked it quickly with another smile. "Of course," she said smoothly. "We don't have to do this very minute, but soon. It's important, Dad. You don't want the stress of paperwork while you're recovering, do you?" Before I could respond, the door opened again. Dr. Evelyn Brooks walked in her white coat, swishing at her sides, a clipboard in her hand. She was brisk, efficient, and she radiated a kind of authority that made even Rachel pause. "Good morning," Dr. Brooks said. She glanced at the papers on the tray, then at Rachel. Her eyes narrowed just slightly, a flicker of suspicion crossing her face. "What's all this?" Rachel straightened, smoothing the papers again. "Just some forms, doctor. Nothing urgent. I'm helping my father stay ahead of the hospital paperwork." Dr. Brooks's gaze lingered on Rachel, then shifted to me. Her eyes searched mine for a long moment as though she could see the words I hadn't spoken. "Mr. Dawson," she said carefully, "you don't need to be signing anything today. Your priority is healing." Rachel's smile stiffened. "Of course, but these are—" "No," Dr. Brooks cut in firmly. She stepped closer, placing a steady hand on the tray. "This can wait. Whatever it is, it can wait." Rachel's cheeks flushed, but she gathered the papers quickly, sliding them back into the folder. She forced another smile, but it no longer reached her eyes. "If you say so, Doctor." Dr. Brooks nodded once. "I do." Then she turned to Rachel, her tone softening but leaving no room for argument. "Would you give us a moment? I need to check on my patient." Rachel hesitated, then pressed her lips together. She leaned down, kissed my forehead, the gesture mechanical. "I'll be back later, Dad," she murmured, then turned sharply on her heel and left the room, the folder tucked under her arm like contraband. The door clicked shut behind her. The silence that followed was thick, filled with the hum of machines and the pounding of my own heart. The waiting room at St. Mary's smelled of antiseptic and burnt coffee. I sat there with my hands folded, staring at the scuffed linoleum. My body was still weak from surgery, but my mind was alive with questions. Rachel had driven me here brisk and businesslike, but she hadn't come inside. She claimed she had errands, though I suspected she didn't want to be seen waiting with me. I could still hear her last words echoing in my ears, "Dad, that account is ours now. You just need to let it go." I thought the worst sting would be from the incision across my chest, but no. What cut deeper was the way my daughter spoke of money as if it meant more than blood. The nurse called my name, her voice muffled behind a surgical mask. I rose slowly, clutching my cane. Each step felt heavier than the last. She guided me down a quiet hallway where the hum of machines and the distant beeps of monitors created a rhythm I'd grown familiar with. Dr. Brooks was waiting in her office. She was a tall woman in her 50s, her posture as straight as a metronome with gray streaks in her hair that seemed to announce she'd seen it all. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. Instead, she gestured for me to sit and folded her hands on the desk. "Frank," she said, her voice steady but tinged with concern. "There's something I need to share with you. It's not easy." My stomach tightened. For a moment, I thought she was about to tell me the surgery hadn't been successful. She leaned forward. "After your operation, while you were still recovering in ICU, your daughter came to me. She asked me to sign additional paperwork, a power of attorney granting her full control over your finances and decisions. She wanted it backdated, as though you had agreed before surgery." I felt the blood drain from my face. My fingers curled against the armrest. "Rachel," I whispered, though the name tasted bitter. Dr. Brooks nodded. I refused, of course. That isn't how the law works, and it isn't how I work. I told her I wouldn't risk my license or my conscience. I also contacted your attorney, Tony Delgado, to document the request. He has the details. I sat in silence, my chest rising and falling like I'd run a mile. Memories rushed through me. Rachel at 6 years old clutching my hand on her first day of school. Rachel as a teenager borrowing the car for prom night. Rachel holding my arm at her wedding whispering thank you. And now Rachel forging papers behind my back. I struggled to speak. She actually asked you to falsify legal documents." "Yes," Dr. Brooks said firmly. "I want you to know, Frank, I take no pleasure in telling you this. But I couldn't keep it from you. It's serious and dangerous. If she's willing to cross that line, she may be willing to cross others." I looked out the window where autumn leaves scraped against the glass in the wind. My heart pounded, not from illness but from betrayal. I thought of Helen, my late wife. What would she say if she saw our daughter plotting like this? The woman Helen had sung lullabies to was gone, replaced by someone cold and calculating. Dr. Brooks's voice softened. "I've seen families torn apart in hospital corridors, but I've also seen patients fight back with the truth, with integrity. You're not alone in this. Tony Delgado is aware, and he's ready to support you. Whatever you choose to do next, I'll testify if needed." Her words settled over me like a heavy quilt. For a moment, I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of years pressing down. I had always believed silence was the safer road, that keeping peace with Rachel and her husband, even as they chipped away at my dignity, was better than open conflict. But silence had delivered me here, weak, cornered, betrayed. When I opened my eyes again, something inside me had shifted. My voice came out low, steady. "If they want a war," I said, staring at the floor before lifting my gaze to meet hers, "they'll get one." Dr. Brooks didn't flinch. She simply nodded, as though she'd expected nothing less. Leaving Dr. Brooks's office, I moved slower than usual, but not because of the surgery. The weight of her words pressed on my shoulders heavier than any cane could support. The hallway stretched long and sterile, a place I had walked countless times before, but this time every step felt like crossing into another life. When I reached the lobby, I sat for a moment watching families gather around patients, some with flowers, others with tears. I wondered how many of them knew the quiet sting of betrayal. Most probably believed their children would fight for them, not against them. Tony Delgado called that evening. His voice was calm, seasoned, from years in courtrooms where family members clawed at each other over inheritances. "Frank," he said, "Dr. Brooks filled me in. I've secured the report. We have documentation of what Rachel requested. If she tries to move forward with anything, we'll be ready to strike back." I gripped the phone tight. "Strike back," I repeated, almost tasting the words. They felt foreign to me. For years, my role had been provider peacekeeper, the man who held the family together. Now I was being forced into a role I never wanted, defender against my own blood. Listen, Tony continued, you don't have to decide everything tonight. But silence is a decision too, Frank. And right now it only benefits them. After the call, I sat in the recliner by the window, the same spot Helen used to favor in the evenings. The empty chair beside me still carried her memory. I could almost hear her humming, see her knitting needles clicking in rhythm. She would never have imagined Rachel in this light. Or maybe she would have seen it before I did. Helen always had a sharper eye for people. That night, sleep didn't come easy. I lay awake watching the shadows crawl across the ceiling, hearing Rachel's voice in the back of my mind. Not the child's voice asking for a bedtime story, but the cold whisper in the hospital room. That account is ours now. The first time I left the hospital, the air hit me harder than I expected. It was cold raw, with the dampness that clings to Michigan mornings, and it carried the smell of wet leaves scattered across the parking lot. I leaned on my cane, one slow step at a time, feeling the weight of stitches deep in my hip. Every movement reminded me that I wasn't the man I once was, but I was still a man capable of choices. Rachel had driven me home, making polite small talk as though the folder of papers never existed. She stocked the fridge with groceries, arranged my medications in a pill organizer, and smiled too much. Her voice was sugar, but her eyes flicked to my nightstand more than once, as though measuring the distance between my hand and the checkbook that lay inside. When she finally left, I called Dr. Brooks. She wasted no time. A few hours later, she phoned back and gave me a name. Tony Delgado, lawyer, trusted. That was how I found myself a few days later at McKinley's Diner, a squat building with peeling paint and a neon sign that buzzed louder than it glowed. It was the kind of place Margaret and I used to come to after church on Sundays. The same cracked vinyl booths, the same smell of bacon grease that never really left the air. Tony was already there, seated in a corner booth with his briefcase beside him. He wasn't much younger than me, gray at the temples, with a sturdy build that looked like it had seen its share of fights outside courtrooms. He rose when I shuffled over, offering his hand. "Frank Dawson," he said warmly. "I've heard a little about your situation. Let's sit." I lowered myself into the booth, the seat sighing beneath me. A waitress came by with a pot of coffee, and Tony gestured for 2 cups. The warmth of the mug in my hands steadied me more than the cane had. "I won't waste your time," Tony began. "Dr. Brooks told me your daughter has been pushing for you to sign financial documents. That true?" I nodded slowly. "Papers for power of attorney. She says it's to help with bills while I heal." Tony's lips pressed thin. "That's usually how it starts. Sometimes it's innocent, sometimes it's not. But in your case, it lines up with other signs." "What signs?" I asked. "She's moving quickly while you're still vulnerable. She's framing it as stress relief. And you overheard her talking to her husband about taking control. Those aren't small things." I shifted the mug between my palms. "What can she do if I don't sign?" Tony leaned back. "If she's determined she can petition the probate court for conservatorship, that would mean claiming you're no longer able to manage your own affairs. Judges don't hand those out lightly, but I've seen families succeed by exaggerating weakness, bringing in doctors willing to sign statements, painting the parent as confused." I felt a chill crawl through me, sharper than the Michigan wind. "She'd go that far." "You know your daughter better than I do," Tony said evenly. "But from what I've heard, it's not impossible. That's why we need to stay ahead." He slid his briefcase closer, clicked it open, and pulled out a folder with his own stack of papers. "There are ways to protect what you've built," he continued. "One option is to move your accounts into a charitable trust. Something in honor of your late wife, perhaps. That way the money is locked in with terms you set and no one can touch it without violating the law." The words landed like a spark on dry wood. A trust, a shield, a way to turn the very thing Rachel wanted into something she could never claim. Tony must have seen the shift in my eyes because he leaned forward. "You told Dr. Brooks your wife's name was Margaret. We could call it Margaret's Promise. Funds to support causes that mattered to her. It would honor her memory and keep your estate out of reach from anyone who doesn't have your best interest at heart. Margaret's Promise." Hearing her name spoken aloud in this plan stirred something deep in me. She had been the heart of every decision we made together, and even now, years after her passing, she could still guide the way. I set the mug down my hand, steady for the first time since surgery. "I want to hear more," I said. Tony nodded. "Good, but understand, this isn't just about documents. It's about timing appearances the way you carry yourself. If Rachel is already considering a conservatorship, she'll be watching for any sign of weakness. You'll need to show her and everyone else that you're still in charge." His words reminded me of standing in the rail yard decades ago, facing down a supervisor who thought I was too slow, too old even then. I had proven him wrong by outworking men half my age. And now, in a different kind of yard, I would prove it again. I lifted my eyes to Tony. "Tell me what needs to be done." His mouth curved into a small smile, one that carried both gravity and respect. That's what I was hoping to hear. Tony pushed the folder toward me, the edges worn soft from years of use. Inside were clean documents, the kind that looked ordinary enough to anyone passing by, but I understood their weight. They weren't just paper, they were armor. He flipped to the first page and tapped it with his finger. "This outlines the framework for the trust. We'd establish Margaret's Promise as a charitable entity in your name and hers. The money you've saved goes there. From that moment on, it's no longer something your daughter can claim. It becomes dedicated to causes you choose: food banks, scholarships, church programs, whatever you see fit." I traced the edge of the paper with my finger. My hands weren't as steady as they once were, but for the first time in weeks I felt I was holding something solid, something mine. "Would I still have access?" I asked. Tony nodded. "You'll remain trustee until the day you decide otherwise. That means you decide how the funds are used. But here's the beauty of it. If anyone tries to challenge your ability to manage your affairs, the court will see the trust as binding and well-structured. It'll be out of their reach." I leaned back, the vinyl booth creaking under my weight. A waitress passed by with a tray of burgers, and for a moment, the sizzle from the kitchen mixed with Tony's calm, certain voice. It reminded me how life goes on outside the storm, and how important it was to protect what little calm I had left. Tony closed the folder but left his hand on top of it. "Frank, you need to prepare yourself. Once Rachel realizes she can't get you to sign those papers, she may push harder. Conservatorship petitions can get messy. She'll paint you as confused, weak, unable to make decisions. You'll have to show the opposite. You'll need to stand taller than they expect." I stared into my coffee, the dark surface rippling with the tremor in my hand. "Standing taller," I repeated softly. "That's a lot to ask of a man with stitches in his hip." Tony chuckled lightly, not unkind. "You've already stood taller than most by coming here. That tells me you're ready." I thought of Margaret again, the way she used to hold my hand at the end of a church service, her thumb brushing across my knuckles as if to remind me I was never alone. For a long time I believed her passing meant I'd lost that anchor, but sitting here with Tony's steady eyes on mine, I realized maybe her promise wasn't gone. Maybe it had just shifted into a new kind of duty. I lifted my gaze. "If Rachel pushes me, I won't fold. I can promise you that." Tony's expression softened, though his tone stayed firm. "Then let's make sure you've got every tool you need. I'll draw up the documents. We'll file the paperwork discreetly. By the time your daughter knows what's happened, it'll already be beyond her reach." The waitress came by again, topping off our cups. She smiled at me, not knowing the battlefield that had just been mapped out on the table between us. I thanked her, then looked back at Tony. "What's it going to cost me?" I asked. He shook his head. "Less than what it would cost if you did nothing. Trust me, Frank. It's not just money we're protecting, it's your dignity, and that's priceless." For the first time since surgery, I felt a pulse of strength that wasn't dulled by pain medication. It was the strength of resolve of a man who still had choices left to make. I reached across the table, my hand closing around his. "Do it. Let's make Margaret's Promise real." Tony gripped my hand firmly, sealing the pact. "Then we begin now." When I left the diner, the cold air no longer felt like a burden. It felt bracing, like a challenge. The cane still bore my weight, but my heart was lighter. Rachel thought she'd cornered me. She had no idea the ground was shifting under her feet. I didn't need to be told that Rachel and Mark were talking about me behind closed doors. I could feel it. Even when the phone stayed quiet, even when the house settled into its old creaks and sighs, there was a hum in the air that told me their plotting hadn't stopped. What I didn't know, not then at least, was how desperate Mark had become. Rachel's house was just across town, tucked neatly in one of those subdivisions where every lawn looked clipped by the same hand. Behind those blinds, Rachel and Mark sat across from each other at their polished dining table, the one they had bought on credit years earlier. Mark's hand drummed against the surface. "We can't keep waiting, Rachel. I told you the credit cards are maxed out and the bank's been calling me every other day. We need that account. Now?" Rachel's voice was sharp but softer than his. "I told you he's weaker than he lets on, but he's still not signing." He stalled at the hospital and doctor. "Brooks is watching him like a hawk. If we push too fast, it could backfire." Mark leaned in, eyes tight, jaw set. "We're already drowning. Do you want the bank repossessing the car? Do you want the neighbor seeing the foreclosure sign? You said it yourself that money is the safety net. And it's sitting there while he fiddles around with his pride." Rachel rubbed her temple, her composure cracking for a moment. "He's my father, Mark. Then act like it means something." Mark snapped, then softened when he saw her flinch. "Look, I'm not saying this is easy, but pride won't pay the mortgage. That account will." Rachel fell silent, the words hanging in the air, heavier than the chandelier above them. Back at my house, I moved slowly through the rooms. It felt strange to be home again, the quiet pressing in around me. Margaret's touches lingered everywhere. The crocheted throw on the couch, the framed hymns in the hallway, the scent of lavender still faint in the guest room. I leaned on my cane, taking it in. It felt both like a comfort and a test. Outside, I heard the crunch of footsteps on gravel. Janet Harper, my neighbor of 30 years, was at the gate. She waved through the slats, her gray hair frizzing in the autumn wind. "Well, look who's back on his feet," she called, her voice bright with genuine warmth. I managed a smile and stepped onto the porch. Back on my feet might be generous. More like back on my cane. She laughed, the sound light and familiar. "Cane or not, it's good to see you home. We were worried." Her concern touched me, though I kept it hidden under a polite nod. Janet had always been the sort who noticed things, the color of the leaves, the cracks in the sidewalk, the strain in a neighbor's voice. I wondered if she noticed the weight behind my forced smile. "I'll be fine," I said. "Just need to take things slow." She squinted at me as if weighing whether to believe me, then gave a firm nod. "If you need anything, you holler. I mean it, Frank. Don't try to play the tough guy all the time." After she left, I stood on the porch longer than I needed to, watching the street, the way the kids rode their bikes in lazy circles, the way the wind rattled the bare branches. I felt the pressure closing in, though I couldn't name it yet. The phone rang that evening, its shrill tone cutting through the quiet. I shuffled to the side table and picked it up. On the other end was a clipped professional voice. "Mr. Dawson, this is Daniel from First Midland Bank. I wanted to inform you that your account has been temporarily frozen pending verification. It's a standard procedure when there are conflicting requests for authority. Once we've confirmed the rightful control, the hold will be lifted." The words drained the warmth from the room. I gripped the receiver tighter. "Conflicting requests." "Yes, sir. There was a recent submission requesting financial authority under your name. Until we can sort this out, no withdrawals or transfers can be processed. It should only take a few weeks, assuming everything checks out." I thanked him stiffly, hung up, and stood in the silence of my living room. My reflection in the window stared back at me, pale and tight-jawed. The battle had officially begun. I sat there for a long time after the call, staring at the phone as if it might ring again. The steady tick of the old mantel clock filled the silence, each beat reminding me that time was no longer on my side. Rachel was moving faster than I had expected. When I finally picked myself up and shuffled into the kitchen, the smell of coffee grounds from that morning still lingered. I poured myself a half-cup lukewarm, but I needed the taste of something familiar. The bitterness steadied me. The next morning, Rachel showed up at my door with that same too-bright smile, Mark trailing behind her. She carried a paper bag of groceries, setting it down on the counter as though she had come only to help. "How are you feeling, Dad?" she asked, her tone sugar-sweet. "I'm getting by," I answered, lowering myself into the kitchen chair. Mark leaned against the counter, arms crossed. He didn't waste time. "We heard from the bank," he said. "They said things are frozen until it's cleared up. That's a problem. Bills don't stop just because the bank drags its feet." Rachel shot him a look as if to remind him of the performance they were supposed to put on. She turned back to me, her voice softer. "It's just a hiccup, Dad. Once everything is straightened out, we'll be able to handle things more smoothly. That's why those papers are so important. It shows the bank you trust me to take care of things." I sipped the cold coffee, letting the silence stretch. I wanted them to feel it, the weight of words unsaid. Finally, I looked at Rachel. "Funny," I said quietly. "I already spoke with the bank. They told me the same thing. Conflicting requests, they called it." Rachel froze just for a moment, then recovered. "Well, that's what I mean. If you sign, there won't be a conflict anymore." Mark's jaw tightened. "The longer this drags on, the worse it gets." I set the mug down with a faint thud. "I'll think about it," I said. It was enough to make them back off for now, though I saw the frustration in Mark's shoulders as they left. The car pulled away from the driveway, two fast tires crunching the gravel. Later that day, Janet stopped by again, holding a casserole dish wrapped in foil. "Thought you could use a warm meal," she said with a smile, but her eyes lingered on my face, reading the lines there. "Something's bothering you." I forced a chuckle, just the usual. Banks and paperwork. Janet didn't press, but her hand squeezed my shoulder before she left. That small touch reminded me I wasn't entirely alone, even if the fight ahead felt that way. That evening, I found myself at the desk in my study. Margaret's picture sat in its silver frame, her smile steady, her eyes full of the kind of strength I needed to borrow. I whispered into the quiet. "They think they've got me cornered. But they don't know who they're up against." The phone buzzed again. This time it was Tony. His voice was calm, but edged with urgency. "Frank, I got word from the bank too. They froze the account just as expected. That's pressure, but it's also protection. It means nothing moves until we finalize the trust. We're on the clock now." I leaned back, closing my eyes. "Pressure, yes. But also a chance." "All right," I said. "Then let's make it official. Margaret's promise. We move forward now." Tony's reply came steady and sure. "Then you'll have what you need, and they'll never see it coming." As I hung up, I felt the walls of my house close in and open up at the same time. Rachel thought freezing the account would trap me. Instead, it had lit the fire under my feet. The game was shifting, and for once, it was on my terms. The following Sunday, I made my way slowly into the church hall, leaning harder on my cane than I truly needed. The congregation bustled around me, of familiar faces offering handshakes and gentle pats on the back. I nodded, smiled faintly, and let them believe I was weaker than I was. Sometimes you had to let people underestimate you if you wanted the truth to rise to the surface. Rachel was there too, perched at a folding table near the coffee urns, chatting with a small group of women she liked to impress. I kept my distance, but my ears were sharper than they gave me credit for. One of the women asked, "How's your dad doing?" "We've been praying for his recovery." Rachel leaned in, her voice dropping to what she must have thought was a private murmur. "He's fine. Honestly, everything's taken care of. It's only a matter of time now. Our family finances are squared away. I'll be able to handle things." The pride in her tone cut deeper than any scalpel. She was standing in the same fellowship hall where Margaret had once organized potluck dinners, boasting as though I had already been signed off like an old account. What Rachel didn't know was that Caleb Monroe, sitting just a few rows behind, caught every word. Caleb had been my neighbor long before Rachel had left for college. A wiry man with more years behind him than ahead, he had always carried himself with a quiet sort of decency. I saw his head tilt slightly at Rachel's words, his brow furrow, as if something didn't add up. I played my part that morning, letting my hands shake a little as I poured coffee, letting my shoulders slump as if the hymn books were too heavy. Rachel saw me and smiled, politely confident as ever. That was exactly what I wanted. Let her grow comfortable. Let her think victory was already hers. That evening, after the pews had emptied and the casserole dishes had been carried home, I sat in my study with Margaret's picture glowing faintly in the lamplight. The phone rang. Tony's voice came steady and low. "Frank, I've drafted the framework. It's time we talk about the big reveal." I straightened in my chair, feeling the weight of those words. The big reveal. The moment the curtain would lift and Rachel would see just how wrong she had been. Tony didn't waste time with pleasantries. "We'll keep this simple, Frank. Rachel believes she's already won. That arrogance is the crack we'll use. When the time comes, you'll let her step onto the stage she's built for herself, and then we'll pull the curtain back. I lean forward in my chair, Margaret's picture glinting in the lamplight. How exactly I'll finalize the charitable trust documents under Margaret's promise, Tony explained. The bank will recognize it as the controlling entity. That means when Rachel tries to claim authority, she'll be met with a locked door. But here's the important part: we won't just rely on paperwork. We'll time the reveal so that your family, your neighbors, even the church community witnesses it. There's no undoing public truth. The thought of Rachel standing in front of people she admired, forced to face her own greed, carried a bitter satisfaction. Still, I felt a pang. She's my daughter, Tony. This isn't easy. His voice softened but stayed steady. It shouldn't be easy, Frank, but it has to be done. She crossed a line when she tried to strip you of your dignity. This way you don't just defend yourself. You remind her what integrity looks like. I let his words settle. Outside, the wind rattled the gutters, carrying dry leaves down the street. I imagined Margaret's voice in that rustle, reminding me that justice, no matter how painful, was still a kind of love. When I asked finally, "In a couple of weeks," Tony said, "we'll arrange a gathering, something Rachel can't resist attending. She'll believe she's there to declare victory. That's when we present the truth. Until then, play the part. Let her think you're fading. Let her get comfortable. The bigger her confidence, the harder the fall." I nodded, though he couldn't see me. "All right, I'll play weak. I've had enough practice at that lately." Tony chuckled a dry sound. "Just don't forget what's underneath. You're not weak, Frank. You're setting the stage." When I hung up, the house felt unusually still, like the quiet before a storm. I sat back and studied Margaret's picture once more. Her smile was steady, unshaken, as though she knew I'd find the strength when the time came. Rachel was the one who suggested it, though she framed it as if it had been my idea all along. "Dad," she said over the phone, her voice syrupy sweet, "why don't we host a little gathering at your house? Just close friends and family. People want to see you, and it would be good to show everyone you're doing better." I knew what she meant. It wasn't about me being better. It was about her being ready to announce what she thought was her triumph. I could hear it in the lift of her voice, the certainty underneath her careful words. I agreed, of course. I told her it would be nice to have some company. I even thanked her for taking the initiative. Let her think I was softening. The higher she built her stage, the louder the crash when it all came down. The day of the gathering, the house filled faster than I expected. Janet arrived first, carrying another casserole dish, though her eyes searched mine as though she was measuring something deeper. Behind her came Caleb Monroe, his wiry frame leaning on the same cane he'd carried for years. He gave me a quiet nod, the kind that told me he hadn't forgotten what he overheard at church. Rachel and Mark bustled about like hosts, greeting neighbors at the door, ushering people into the living room. It was strange to watch them act as though this house, Margaret's and mine, was theirs. Mark even adjusted the framed family photo on the mantel, setting it at an angle he preferred. My jaw tightened, but I said nothing. The living room filled with murmurs. Neighbors settled into the old armchairs, balancing paper plates of appetizers Rachel had ordered from the grocery store. The air smelled faintly of reheated meatballs and store-bought cookies, nothing like the homemade spreads Margaret used to lay out. I sat in my recliner, the same one that had molded to my shape over the years, and let my shoulders sag. My cane rested across my lap. I kept my gaze low, my breathing steady but shallow, playing the role of a man too tired to resist. Every so often I caught Rachel glancing at me with satisfaction, as if she were confirming her victory to herself. The chatter grew into low waves of speculation. I heard Snippet's neighbors wondering why Rachel had invited them all, whether I was planning to move, whether my health had taken another turn. People weren't fools. They sensed something in the air, a storm brewing just beyond the curtains. Janet leaned toward Caleb, her voice barely above a whisper. "This doesn't feel right. He looks worse than he did last week." Caleb frowned, his sharp eyes fixed on me. "Don't be so sure. Sometimes what looks weak isn't weak at all." I almost smiled at that. Almost. Rachel finally stood at the front of the room, smoothing the skirt of her dress as if preparing for a performance. She cleared her throat, her eyes sweeping across the faces of neighbors and friends. Mark hovered at her side, a folder clutched tightly in his hands. "Thank you all for coming." Rachel began, her voice calm but carrying a note of triumph. "It means a lot to have our community gathered here. Tonight is about family, about making sure things are secure for the future. I felt every eye glance toward me, waiting, watching. I kept still, letting the silence grow. Rachel reached for the folder, her fingers brushing against Mark's. The moment stretched in the air, heavy with anticipation. And then she smiled a smile that was too wide, too certain. Tonight, she said, we're ready to share some important news. Mark slid the folder onto the coffee table, tapping it once for emphasis. Rachel's hand rested on top of it, her nails gleaming under the lamplight. I kept my gaze lowered, my heart steady. The storm had gathered. All that remained was to let it break. Rachel cleared her throat, her fingers trembling just enough for me to notice. She looked around the room, her eyes sweeping across familiar faces, neighbors who had shared Sunday potlucks with Margaret, church friends who had brought casseroles when she passed, and old co-workers who still checked in from time to time. Every gaze settled on Rachel, and she soaked it in like stage lights warming her skin. Thank you for being here tonight. She began, her voice quivering slightly before finding its rhythm. It's not easy watching a parentage, watching them struggle. We all know how much my father has carried over the years, and I'm grateful for everything he's done. But now it's time for a change. From today on, I'll manage all of Dad's finances. Her words struck like a hammer. The room went still, the silence punctured only by the tick of the mantel clock. Janet's lips parted, her eyes flashing disbelief. Caleb shifted in his chair, his cane pressing harder into the carpet. A few neighbors looked down at their hands as if embarrassed for her. Rachel smiled wider, mistaking the stunned silence for acceptance. Mark stepped forward, his grin stretched tight, and lifted a chilled bottle of champagne from the side table. With a practiced twist, he popped the cork, the sound exploding like a gunshot in the heavy air. Foam fizzed over the lip of the bottle as he filled a line of cheap flutes Rachel had laid out earlier. To new beginnings, Mark announced, handing Rachel a glass. To family security, Rachel echoed, raising hers high. The clinking of glasses was hesitant at best. Some neighbors sipped politely, others set theirs down untouched. Janet didn't even lift hers, just folded her arms, her gaze darting between me and Rachel. I sat in my recliner, my body still, my cane balanced across my knees. I didn't move to take a glass. I didn't flinch when Rachel lifted hers in my direction as though offering me a toast. Instead, I kept my gaze fixed on a spot beyond the window, watching the bare branches sway against the darkening sky. Inside, my chest burned with the weight of her words. She thought she had taken everything. She thought this was her victory lap, her grand declaration. And yet the deeper her voice rang with pride, the more fragile it all felt. Rachel lowered her glass slightly, her eyes narrowing when she realized I hadn't acknowledged her. "Dad," she said, her voice tightening. "Don't you have something to say?" I slowly turned my head, meeting her gaze with eyes that had seen more winters than she could fathom. But I said nothing. The silence was sharper than any rebuke, and it rippled through the room until even the champagne bubbles seemed to fall quiet. Then, just as Rachel drew a breath to recover, a knock rattled the front door. 3 firm, deliberate strikes. The room stirred, heads turning. Janet's brows arched, Caleb straightened, and Mark's grin faltered. Rachel blinked, thrown off rhythm. I didn't move. My heart knew the sound before my mind caught up. The knock came again, slower this time, echoing through the house like a verdict being read. Rachel set her glass down, forcing a laugh. "I'll get it," she said, smoothing her dress with one hand as she crossed the room. When she opened the door, the night air spilled in, carrying the scent of wet leaves and distant wood smoke, and there he stood. Tony Delgado, my attorney. His leather briefcase clutched firmly in one hand, a thick stack of papers tucked under his arm. His expression was calm, his eyes unyielding. "Good evening," he said, his voice steady enough to still the room. "I think we need to clear up a few things." The room shifted as if the very walls had inhaled. Rachel stood frozen at the doorway, her hand still on the knob, her smile cracking at the edges. Mark's grip on the champagne bottle tightened, his knuckles whitening. Tony stepped inside, unhurried, the sound of his shoes clicking softly against the hardwood floor. He set his briefcase down on the coffee table right beside Rachel's neatly stacked folder. The contrast between the two was stark. Hers, thin, flimsy, full of false promises. His heavy, worn, carrying the weight of truth. "Who invited you?" Rachel snapped, her voice higher than she intended. I go where my client needs me, Tony answered calmly. His eyes flicked to me, then back to Rachel. And tonight it seems my client's interests are under discussion. A ripple went through the neighbors seated around the room. Janet leaned forward, hands folded tight in her lap. Caleb's eyes narrowed with interest. Rachel tried to laugh, but it came out brittle. There's no need for theatrics. Everything is already settled. Dad has agreed that Mark and I will take over. We were just about to make it official. Tony arched a brow and opened his briefcase. He pulled out a thick stack of documents bound with a firm clip. I believe you're mistaken. What you are about to do was mislead this room. What I have here is the only binding agreement regarding Mr. Dawson's finances. The words landed like stones thrown into still water. Gasps circled the room, whispers rising like a tide. Mark stepped forward, face flushing red. This is a family matter. You've got no right. On the contrary. Tony cut in smoothly. I have every right as Frank's attorney of record. And since your wife has chosen to make this a public announcement, it's only fair that the truth be presented publicly as well. He laid the documents on the table with deliberate care. The top page bore the title in bold print, Margaret's Promise, Charitable Trust. Rachel's face drained of color. Her lips moved, but no words came out. Mark slammed the champagne bottle down onto the sideboard, the fizz spilling over like his temper. I finally leaned forward in my recliner, the cane sliding softly against the carpet. My voice, though quiet, carried across the room. You thought you could take what was never yours, but this house, this community, this name, they were built with love, not greed. And that love now carries Margaret's name forward, not yours. Janet's hand flew to her mouth. Caleb let out a low whistle. The neighbor's eyes darted from Rachel to me, their judgment plain. Rachel staggered a step back, her hand clutching at the folder she had guarded so tightly. No, she whispered, her voice raw. That's not possible. You can't. Tony's tone was cool and final. It's already filed with the court and recognized by the bank. The assets are secure. From this moment on, they are untouchable. The last words seemed to slam the door on Rachel's illusion of victory. The champagne glasses trembled on the coffee table, the fizz fading into silence. For the first time that evening, I let myself meet her eyes fully. I saw the anger, the shock, the betrayal of her own expectations. But beneath it all, I thought I caught something else. A flicker of fear. Rachel's fingers clawed at the edge of the coffee table, knuckles pale, her breathing uneven. For the first time that evening, the mask she'd worn slipped, revealing the raw desperation underneath. Mark, standing behind her, slammed his hand down hard on the table, rattling the champagne glasses and sending a few drops of golden fizz onto the carpet. This is ridiculous, he barked, his voice reverberating off the walls. You can't just barge in here and rewrite everything we've worked for. A ripple of whispers broke through the crowd. Janet leaned closer to Caleb, murmuring something I couldn't catch, while Caleb shook his head slowly, as though confirming a suspicion he'd carried all along. A couple of neighbors stifled chuckles, unable to contain the dark humor of it all. Rachel's eyes darted from the stack of papers Tony had laid out to the faces around the room. The confidence she had displayed earlier was evaporating fast like mist under the morning sun. This isn't how it's supposed to be, she whispered, but the words carried more to herself than to anyone else. I shifted in my chair, the leather creaking beneath me. With deliberate care, I planted the cane on the carpet and pressed my weight into it. Slowly, steadily, I rose to my feet. Every movement seemed to echo louder than it should have, commanding attention without a single word. The room fell silent as I straightened, standing taller than I had in weeks. I looked at my daughter, her face flushed with anger and humiliation, and I let the weight of my years pour into the space between us. Money that comes from love. I said, my voice low, but carrying, will never be used for greed. The words hung in the air like a hammer suspended mid-swing. No one dared move. No one dared breathe. I saw Janet's eyes glisten, and Caleb gave the smallest of nods, like he'd been waiting to hear those words all night. Rachel shook her head violently, her voice breaking into a scream. This is mine. Do you hear me, mine? She jabbed her finger toward the papers on the table, her desperation spilling out in front of everyone she had hoped to impress. But the room did not side with her. Instead, the silence grew heavier, pressing down like a judgment. Even the old mantel clock seemed to pause its ticking, muted, under the weight of the moment. Rachel's outburst echoed through the living room, but it didn't carry the power she expected. Instead of sympathy, her words fell flat, met with lowered eyes and murmurs of disapproval. Janet shook her head slowly, the kind of gesture that said more than any sermon. Caleb's lips curled into something halfway between pity and contempt. Rachel spun toward the crowd, desperate now. You all know me. You know I've taken care of Dad these past weeks. You've seen how weak he's been. I did this for him for his protection, but no one spoke up. A few neighbors shifted uncomfortably, some looked away. The silence cut sharper than any accusation. Mark slammed his hand down again, rattling the table. This is nonsense, he growled. You're all just jealous. You think you know what's best for us. You don't. His face was red, his chest heaving. Then without warning, he shoved his chair back so hard it scraped against the floor. I'm done, he spat, glaring at Rachel. You wanted this so badly, you handle it. He stalked out of the room, the front door slamming behind him with a finality that shook the picture frames on the wall. Rachel stood frozen. Her mouth open, her eyes darting between the door and the faces surrounding her. The folder in her hands trembled. Without Mark beside her, she looked small, diminished, exposed. I took a step closer, steadying myself on the cane. Do you see it now? I asked softly, though my words carried through the room. When you choose greed over love, you lose everything, even the people standing at your side. Rachel shook her head wildly, tears spilling now. No, Dad, I was only trying. But her words collapsed under the weight of the truth. No one rushed to comfort her. No one offered a kind hand. The neighbors who had once smiled at her now sat with folded arms, their judgment written plainly across their faces. Tony gathered his papers into his briefcase, his expression calm but unyielding. This is finished, he said. The law is clear. The trust is protected. Rachel sank into a chair, the strength gone from her body. Her hands covered her face, but even that couldn't hide the sobs breaking loose. I looked at her, my heart torn between sorrow and resolve. Then I turned toward Margaret's photo on the mantel, letting my eyes rest on her steady smile. For the first time in a long while, I felt the weight lifting. The truth had been spoken. The storm had broken. If you enjoyed this story, please like the video. Subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box to the right.